Hello, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to this parallel session. It's my pleasure to present today our first presenter, keynote speaker, Dr. Michela Le Pira. She is going to present Shaping Sustainable Urban Mobility, the role of ISAHP and decision support methods in participatory transport planning. Dr. Le Pira is a research fellow and lecturer in transport planning at the University of Catania in Italy, and also is the director of the studies and research of the Italian Association for Traffic and Transport Engineers. Her research focuses on public participation in transport planning, supported by agent-based modeling and multi-criteria decision methods, participatory decision support methods for sustainable urban freight transport policymaking, and new scenarios for passengers and freight transport. She has experience at the University of Roma Tre, at the University of Catania, at the TU Delft in the Netherlands, and also in the UCD and Dublin. She has co-authored more than 80 indexed papers, and she is associate editor of the journal Research and Transportation Business and Management, and member of the editorial board of several journals like Research in Transportation Economics, Journal of Advanced Transportation, and specific and scientific reports, among others. It's a great pleasure. Michela, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anya, for the presentation, and thank you also to Monica and you for the nice invitation. It's nice to see you today. I have to tell you that actually this is an hectic period for me because I had my first child 13 days ago. So sorry if I am not very clear. I hope I will be clear enough. And of course, I will be available for any question that you can have after the presentation, but also in the next days. So I'm going to share the screen with the presentation. Can you confirm that you see it?
Yes.
Okay, and I will put it in the full size mode. Can you see it? Okay. So let's start with this keynote speech. As already said by Anya, the topic is related to sustainable urban mobility. And I'm going to introduce a bit this topic, which is my sector. I work with transport. And in particular, during my PhD studies, but also after the PhD, I tried to understand how the decision-making process in transport could be supported by stakeholder participation, and which type of methods or tools could be suitable to support this process. And so just before, just a quick introduction, even if Anya was already very comprehensive. I'm a civil and transport engineer, and I studied and worked at the University of Catania, but also in Rome, as already Anya said. Actually, in this presentation, I will focus on some of the participatory decision support models and methods. I will not go into the details of other methods like the agent-based modeling approach, just for time constraints. But of course, if you are interested, once again, you can send me an email and we can discuss about it. So this keynote speech will present some applications of ISAHP in combination with other methods and tools, with the idea that these methods could be used to support participatory decisions, and in particular in transport planning. This is a summary of the presentation. So I will introduce the topic, and in particular, I will just explain why transport decision making is a complex issue. I will also introduce the topic of public participation in transport planning, which is something I would say quite new in our sector. This is not very new in land use planning, but in transport planning it has been introduced just some years ago. And then I will present these applications of AHP for two main reasons: to support consensus building in a group of stakeholders and also preference aggregation, and to support participatory spatial analysis. So I'm going to share with you some of the results of our research works done in cooperation with my colleagues from the University of Catania and from other universities, and also with Anya and Monica. And the idea is that these methods could be used to support consensus among stakeholders that can have, of course, different preferences. So let's start with the first part of the presentation. This is just to have some ideas of the key terms and definition. So transport planning is a process. It is a decision-making process that should be based on rationality. This means that we need to perform some technical analysis to understand how we can reach the objectives that we want to achieve, and what are the solutions that we can propose to achieve these objectives. So the idea is to define and implement transport system operations. Public participation means to involve all those that are affected by a decision in the decision-making process. So this is a general definition, but of course there are different types of stakeholders that can be involved, from the citizens, so the general public, to different types of stakeholders according to the problem under consideration. For instance, we have public transport companies, we have transport operators in general that can be involved and that can be affected by decisions related to the transport system. Stakeholders, also in this case, can be defined as people and organizations, individuals or in groups, who hold a stake in a particular issue, but they do not have a formal role in the decision-making process. So this is the reason why transport planning was some years ago a technocratic process. So the decision maker usually was let's say, the mayor of a city, for instance, for decisions regarding the city, the transport system of a city, supported by planners and experts. Well, now the concept has been evolving and changing towards participatory transport planning. And finally, decision support methods. They can be quantitative, mainly quantitative methods. They can also be qualitative methods, but usually these are methods or tools that can be used to help and guide the decision-making process by making the policymaker, but also the planners understand the preferences of stakeholders. So when we talk about transport, we need to focus on sustainability, and this is why we talk about sustainable mobility. As everybody knows, sustainability is very big and encompasses different dimensions: the classical environmental, economic, and social. And you can see that transport has lots of negative externalities, both from an environmental, economic, and social point of view. If we consider, for instance, the environmental pollution caused by transport, and in particular by road transport, but also problems related to climate change, so CO2 emissions, and also the problems related to safety, which is of course a social problem, but also an economic problem. But we should also consider another dimension of sustainability, which can be called institutional sustainability. So this is the way decisions are made, because we know that lots of time, actually, decisions can be contested, and this, of course, can cause a waste of money and time, so of resources. and this is not sustainable from an economic point of view, but also from a social point of view. In Italy, we have lots of examples of decisions that were contested by the stakeholders. The first picture, for instance, is a local case in Catania, because I'm going to show you mainly case studies based in Catania, in my cities, where the retailers protested against the closure of a street because they thought this was against their interests. Actually, lots of people went in this street because it's a beautiful street close to the sea. So it was not true, but they were not involved in the decisions. So this is the problem. So why transport decision making is complex? This is because transport systems are composed of several parts, several aspects. We know that the decisions of a single person, of an individual, are important because they can give rise to collective emergent phenomena, even if they are not connected with other people. So, for instance, my decision of going to work by car can affect the transport system in general, because of course I take this decision independently from the others, but everybody contributes to traffic. So we can say that this is a complex system where the consequences of the actions of the individual actors are not easily predictable. And we know that these decisions actually affect many actors that can have conflicting interests. For instance, by closing a street, a shopping street, we can have protests from the retailers, while, for instance, the citizens are happy because the quality of the air in this street would be better. So we should recognize that transport planning is no more a technocratic process, but it is about to manage a complex, multi-agent decision-making process where we should have different competencies, political, technical, but also communication competencies and abilities. And the important thing is that we should find the solutions that are, from one side, technically consistent, so based on the results of technical analysis, but from the other side, they should maximize stakeholder consensus. So we should consider these two aspects when making decisions. And this means that we should change the traditional approach of the decision maker that decide, announce the decision, and then inevitably defends it or abandon it, to a more deliberative approach where stakeholders are engaged and can deliberate, and the decision is made together. Of course, this decision cannot satisfy everybody, so it will be necessary to defend a little, but if stakeholders are involved, they can be willing also to advocate these solutions to the other peers. So it's easier to implement it. And if you want to have a clear idea of how to combine public participation in transport planning, we should focus on some important pillars or ingredients, as in this slide. The first one is related to the levels of engagement. Of course, there are different levels of engagement, as we can see in this popular ladder of citizen participation by Arnstein, which considers different levels from non-participation to a formal participation, which is the level of tokenism, to the citizen power. But we should understand also that more participation is not the same thing as more democracy, because there can be some interests that are more taken into account than others. So there is also the risk of social exclusion and disadvantage. So one should be careful when setting up the objective and the level of participation. And then we should also consider that decision maker should deal with actors with different levels of knowledge and interest. In general, citizens do not have the competence and knowledge related to the specific issue under consideration, while stakeholders, of course, can be mixed, because there can be competent stakeholders or more interested stakeholders. Consider, for instance, public transport companies or retailers. They are both stakeholders, but of course with very different characteristics. And finally, planners and experts that should hide the decision-making process, having the knowledge and competence, but of course without having any specific interest. The third and last ingredient is the transport planning scheme. This is one by Professor Cascetta and colleagues that was formulated some years ago after the introduction of public participation in transport planning. So you can see that there are mainly three blocks, since this is a process with some feedbacks and loops. The blue block is related to the decision-making process. So we start with the identification of the decision-making context, the analysis of the present situation, so the definition of critical issues and objectives, and then we have, of course, the formulation of alternatives that should be assessed to understand which options we want to implement. So from one side, we have the orange block with all the technical and economic analysis that can help to understand which alternative is preferable with respect to others. From the other side, we have the participation process with different phases, from the identification of stakeholders to the listening of their preferences, phases of information, consultation, finally, the participation in the final decision. So if we consider all these three ingredients and we put them together, we can have this simple scheme where we understand that we have the planners and experts that should be in charge of analyzing the transport system, setting the goals together with the decision makers and the objectives, but this should be also a two-way communication process with the stakeholders, identifying criteria and plan alternatives. So it's like we have a hierarchy, like in the AHP. From one side, we have the technical evaluations. From the other side, thanks to the results of participation, we have group decision-making, and we should have a consensus-based ranking. So the final decision should be based both on the technical evaluations and group decision-making. And this is something that has been envisioned also by the EU with the guidelines on sustainable urban mobility plans that are long-term strategic plans that should be implemented by cities to improve the transport system. And in the so-called SAMP cycle, which is the process of the SAMP, which is a cycle, we have different phases of participation. So the decision should be citizen and stakeholder supporting. Of course, there are different methods of involvement, depends on many aspects on who are the stakeholders to involve, if they are a wider or targeted audience, when to engage according to the phase of the decision-making process, the type of project, if it's something strategic or something much more less strategic, so a day-by-day decision, let's say, and the duration of engagement. So, for instance, we can use interviews, focus group, letters, posters, workshops, citizen juries. There are lots of methods. Of course, there is no one method that is suitable to all these cases. One should be careful when choosing the level of engagement, but also the methods of involvement. So, to conclude this first part, of course, there are some caveats of participation in transport planning. We have to say that this is quite recent. So even if it has been introduced also by law, because we're in the different European states, for instance, we have a law specific for sustainable urban mobility plans, drawing on the guidelines from the EU, and participation is compulsory. Usually, it is not well structured. So the level of engagement is not very clear. The methods of involvement are not very clear. And in particular, we have a lack of tools that can guide this process towards well thought out decisions. And we call them participatory decision support tools. So we have the technical evaluation tools that are very common, and we have different methods that can be used. We use simulations, we use economic analysis, we use multi-criteria decision-making methods. But from the other side, we do not have these methods that can support participation. So in general, we can say that there is a knowledge gap between the methods used for technical evaluations and those adopted to support stakeholder engagement. So this is the main idea of this presentation and of my main research. Let's go to the second part of the presentation. So using ISAHP in combination with other tools, in this case to support consensus building among stakeholders and preference aggregation. So these are some of the research questions during my PhD studies. We are talking about decision support methods, okay, but which decision support methods can help participatory decision-making processes? So this was a first question that I had when I started my PhD. And then, okay, we use this method to hide the process, but how can we support, can help the convergence of opinions in a participatory decision-making process? And finally, how can we involve different stakeholder categories, since we said that there are many different stakeholders, they can have different characteristics, and they can have, of course, different interests. So, one of the, let's say, answers to this question, and in particular the first one, is multi-criteria decision-making methods, because they are decision support methods. Of course, they traditionally were used to support one decision maker's decisions, but we know that can be extended also to group decision-making. And this was done in many cases, in many sectors, and also in the transport sector. For instance, there is a method called MAMCA, multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis by Kati Makaris, that has been used for transport decisions, and in particular for freight transport decisions. MCDM can be considered a good decision support method also for participatory processes. How can we foster the convergence of opinions? There are some tools or some procedures that can help to have consensus. For instance, we can use the Delphi method, and we will see how we used it in a specific case study. To encourage consensus in a group of stakeholders by asking them to align their opinions to the opinions of the majority of the group. But there are also other methods that can be used, of course, if we engage stakeholders and they can discuss among each other, this it would be easier for them to find a consensus. So there are, for instance, consensus votes. We saw, for instance, by using agent-based modeling, how different network structures can be used to foster this convergence of opinions. So in this case, I will present a combination of ISAHP with Delphi, but there are also other methods that can be used. And finally, this is something actually very, very trivial. It is clear that a tailored approach is needed when we need to involve different stakeholders. So we cannot think about using the same method with stakeholders with different characteristics. For instance, the ISAHP, we know that we need to perform interviews with stakeholders and ask many questions related to pairwise comparisons. We need to focus on consistency. So, of course, we cannot use it when we have a very wide group of stakeholders. So we need to find the right approach for the right stakeholders. I will show you a case study where we use the ISAHP to elicit and aggregate stakeholder preferences. We used the Delphi method to build and reach consensus, and we used a simple indicator that we called overlap as a measure of consensus. So I will briefly describe these methods. There is no need to describe actually ISAHP because you know it very well. We know that it can be used to elicit a single decision maker's preferences, but also it can be used for group decision making, and we have different strategies to obtain the priority vector for the group. We also have mathematical aggregation of individual priorities of individual judgments, but we also have the possibility to have a consensus vote. So according to our objective, we can decide to have a mathematical aggregation or a consensus vote. The Delphi method, for those who are not familiar with it, it's a very old method actually that was used in principle to elicit experts' opinion about future scenarios. But nowadays it is also used to ask stakeholders for their opinions and try to find a convergence of opinion after some rounds of anonymous interaction. This means that the panel of stakeholders is asked to answer a questionnaire for the first time, and then this questionnaire is proposed other times with an iterative structure, and they know the opinions of the other members of the panel in an anonymous way and in an aggregated way. So this limits the bias due to leadership and also influence among participants. And there is also the possibilities of asynchronous communication because the questionnaire is given to stakeholders and they can reply when they want. So at each round of this anonymous interaction, the members are asked to align their opinions, if possible, of course, within a range where the 50% of the opinion stands. And the iterations are aimed at mitigating radical positions, so finding a collective decisions. And finally, the overlap. We can consider it as a measure of consensus and of similarities of preferences. If we consider two stakeholders, for instance, we can evaluate the similarity of their preferences. And if we consider a group of stakeholders, we can use it to evaluate the level of consensus of the group of stakeholders with the collective ranking. I don't want to enter too much into the detail because it's just a simple evaluation. It's a scalar product between two binary vectors. The idea is that if we have, for instance, three alternatives, A, B, C, we can have the binary vectors of preferences based on the pairwise couples. So for instance, for stakeholder 1, the preference list is A, B, C. This means that A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C. And this means that we can build the binary vector of pairwise couples where we have the couple AB, AC, and BC. And in this case, they are +1, +1, +1. While if C, for instance, is preferred to B, then for the pairwise comparison BC, the binary vector will have -1 as the element of this pairwise couple. So it's just about doing these types of assessment. And we can evaluate in this way the degree of consensus in a network of stakeholders. This is an indicator which goes between -1 and +1. -1 means that two rankings are completely different, for instance, ABC, CBA, while +1 means that they are exactly the same. 0 means that they are quite uncorrelated. So we know that if it's a value close to 1, then there is a very good degree of consensus. So let's go to the first case study, which is related to a particular topic, which is cycling mobility. Cycling mobility is very important nowadays. We know that it's important not only for recreational purposes, but also for everyday journeys. So, for instance, for home to work trips. But many cities are not ready for them. This means that they have streets that are built in particular for cars, and there are many cars, so safety is not guaranteed, and there is not an adequate planning of infrastructures for cyclists. This is exactly the case of Catania, which is my hometown, and here you can see a picture which is quite emblematic with cars from one side in black and white because they are bad, they pollute, and so on. And from the other side, we have a group of cyclists that are in color. So just to introduce a bit my city, Catania is a medium-sized city in the southern part of Italy and in Sicily. We have the volcano Etna, which is very, very popular, and we have lots of good things, actually. It's a touristic destination, Catania and Sicily in general, apart from Italy in general. But Catania has many problems related to transport. The main one maybe is that there are too many cars. We have a motorization rate, which is the number of cars each 100 inhabitants, of about 80 cars each 100 inhabitants, which is a lot. And we have very few transit trips. Of course, this is because we have a metro line, but it's only few kilometers. And we have, of course, a bus network, but there are not so much reserved lanes, so it is affected by road traffic. So you can imagine that it's not easy to convince people to leave cars and to take a bus. The same applies to bicycles because there is not a network of infrastructures for cyclists, and it's not safe to share streets with motorized vehicles. So we have all of these problems, but actually some years ago the interest in cycling mobility raised. We had a petition from citizens to close the street that I was telling you at the beginning of the speech, which is close to the sea, 1 day per month. So the public administration decided to close the street, but at the same time, we had the citizens that were happy about the decisions and the retailers that were not happy about it because they thought it was not good for their businesses. So it was a typical case of a decision from the bottom up, and that was a bit contested by the stakeholders because they were not involved in this process. But the good thing is that from this experience, we had a permanent solution because 2 years after 2 years of this initiative, we had the building of a new cycle track in this street. So this is a good, I think, a good example of participation from the bottom up. And this is why we decided to focus on this topic because it was very important for our city. And we decided to test some methods, and in particular AHP, and do this participation experiment by involving experts, stakeholders, and citizens in different phases. So first we gave some information and we gathered interest in a public event related to cycling mobility. Then we defined a group of experts and stakeholders, a restricted group, and we built together with them a hierarchy of the problem from the goal to the objective, criteria, and solutions. We used AHP to derive the priority vectors and the preferences of the panel, and we asked them to perform the assessment and align their judgment after one round. So we obtained the panel's priority ranking with this process. And in parallel, we also defined a simplified online questionnaire, and we asked the citizens to express their opinion. So we, in the end, had 2 different priority rankings, the panel's priority ranking and the citizen priority ranking. So these are just some pictures of the different phases. The first phase of the information giving, where we also collected the names of the people that were interested, and then we sent them the questionnaire to fill in. These are some pictures of the panel of experts and stakeholders that was identified and that were involved in this process. So they identified the critical issues related to cycling mobility in Catania, defined the objectives based on these critical issues, some alternatives to reach the objectives, and finally a decision hierarchy. And this is the hierarchy that was used to derive their preferences via the ISAHP. The goal is to promote cycling mobility, and then we have 4 different criteria. The 3 sustainability criteria, and then a transport criterion which was specific to the mode share. So less cars and more cycling, active mobility, or public transport. And then we have also indicators of these criteria. And finally, the alternatives. So we have 5 different alternatives, and I'm going to briefly show them to you. The first one is to build a cycling network, which actually should be composed by different types of paths. It should be an integrated set of protected tracks, reserve lanes, but also local roads with scarce traffic, because the idea is that when the difference of speeds between different vehicles is not high, it's not necessary to build a separate infrastructure. So for instance, in 30 kilometers per hour streets, we do not need to separate the different flows. While if we have, of course, a street where the speeds are higher, then we need to have separated or reserved lanes. So the cyclist should must be in the position to decide the most convenient route to the destination. So it's not about building a single cycling track, but a full network. The second strategy is a bit different because it is a bit wider than the first one, because it would allow also to improve in general the safety conditions of the streets, so active mobility in general also for pedestrians. And it would be to create 30 kilometers per hour zones in the city. Actually, in Italy, we have this debate about 30 kilometers per hour cities. Bologna is the first case of cities that implemented this strategy, which is very effective. But we have lots of protests, of course, from citizens, but also from the decision makers, not the local ones, but the national ones. So it's a controversial topic. But studies demonstrate that if we reduce the speed to 30 kilometers per hour, safety would improve a lot. And also the consequences of accidents would be much lower than with a higher speed. So of course, if we implement 30 kilometers per hour zones in the city, then we do not need to build any cycling infrastructures, and we can guarantee safe roads for cyclists. The third one, the first strategy, of course, is different from the first 2, because it means raising the awareness about cycling, which, as I already said, is quite new in our city because it's a car-oriented city. So it's, of course, a low-cost strategy, which is only intended to increase the awareness of people. And also the fourth strategy is a bit different because it does not focus on infrastructures, but on the vehicles. And the idea was to give subsidies to buy electric bicycles. Actually, this is something that has been done, for instance, during the COVID pandemic to incentivize the use of cycling, of bicycles, since public transport had a reduced capacity. For instance, in Milan, they built an emergency network for cyclists that was the same of the metro network. So the network was the same, and people were encouraged to use the bicycle and not the metro that had limited capacity in that period. And finally, bike sharing. We know that the shared mobility phenomenon is very important nowadays. Actually, now in Catania, we have a bike sharing service, but some years ago, we didn't have it. So the idea is that one can use a bicycle which is not of their own, by renting it for a period of time. And of course, this can be both in stations or free floating. So we can have stations, or we do not have any station, and bicycles can be left in different parts of the cities. So this is what we did. We structured the problem and used ISAHP to elicit their preferences and aggregate them. We used the Delphi method to build consensus among the experts, and we used the overlap to evaluate the degree of consensus. This is just to let you see how we try to align, to make stakeholders align their preferences. For instance, this is related to the criteria. For the stakeholder I, in the previous round, the weight of the environmental criterion derived by HP was 0.56, but we saw that the majority of the opinions of the panel stand between 0.14 and 0.54. So we asked them to, him or her, to align the judgment, and he or she could decide if he wanted to, in this case, decrease a bit the weight of this criterion or maintain the same weight. So this was just to understand if they were willing to align a bit their preferences or not. And finally, the citizen involvement. We took the AHP hierarchy and we built a simplified questionnaire. In this questionnaire, we asked them to rank the 4 different criteria with respect to the goal of promoting cycling mobility, so no pairwise comparisons. And then we asked them to evaluate each alternative with respect to the 4 criteria. Also, in this case, we did not use any pairwise comparisons, even because there were 79 pairwise comparisons. And we asked them to state their relative contribution in achieving the goal with a qualitative scale from very low to very high. And also in this case, we used the overlap to evaluate the degree of consensus. We used social networks, mailing lists to disseminate the survey to citizens. And then for the collective rankings, we used the geometric mean method for the AHP and the aggregation of individual priorities. And then in the simplified questionnaire, the qualitative values were judgments, so very low, very high, were transformed in quantitative values with a scale from 1 to 5. And the aggregation of individual preferences was done using the border rule. So each alternative was assigned a quantitative value based on the position that it had in the individual rankings. And then these values were summed, so to have an overall value for each alternative. And of course, the higher the value, the higher the position in the ranking. So we were able to have a collective ranking by using the border rule. And these are finally the results. In terms of preference ranking, 1 to 5 are the 5 alternatives, the strategies that we considered. So for the citizens, the best strategy would be to implement a cycling network and to create a bike sharing service. You can see, for instance, that the 30 kilometers per hour zone strategy is the last one. While for the Delphi panel, you can see that the ranking has not changed between the first and the second round. And in this case, in the first position, we have the 30 kilometers per hour zone strategy, and in the second one, the cycling network. So, of course, they are different results, but this is something that we were expecting. First, because the panel of experts was composed by people with similar interests, and they discussed between each other. So, of course, the level of overlap is very high, but as you can see, it increased with the round of interaction. So this means that the Delphi method was good in aligning their preferences, even if the ranking in this case did not change, because they were quite aligned also in the first round. For the citizens, of course, this is different because they do not have a specific competence. Maybe they did not understand very well this strategy of the 30 kilometers per hour zone. And of course, the overlap is it's not very low, because you know that it's between -1 and +1, but it's not high, since there were more than 80 people, and they did not discuss the problem. They just had to fill a questionnaire. We also performed the test with the students. We usually do tests with students, by making them reply to both questionnaires, and there are some differences in the replies. Also, the level of similarity, so the consensus was higher with the online survey than with the HP questionnaire, but this is because they were not informed very well about the problem. They just had to reply. So maybe in this case, when we talked about the tailored approach, it is good to have a simplified questionnaire with citizens, while it is better to have a more structured questionnaire and use more structured methods like the AHP when we have fewer people which are more involved and more competent about this problem. So this was the main case study, but if I have just 8 minutes, I will show you the other ones related to spatial analysis. And here I reported some of the papers that were published about this combination of AHP for consensus building. In some of them, there is also the use of agent-based models. So if you're interested, you can have a look at them. Last part related to the use of AHP to support participatory spatial analysis. So let's see what we've done and we are doing in our research. Of course, transport is a spatial problem. So since it is a spatial problem, we have different criteria which are usually spatially based, and we also have multiple evaluation criteria. So GIS and also multi-criteria decision-making methods can be powerful tools in assessing solutions. If we combine these tools, we can also have a tool that can support participation in the process, because we have different maps. So we have the power of visualization thanks to GIS, and we can use the weights, for instance, derived from AHP to weigh the different criteria and see the results of different alternatives in terms of impacts. So in general, when we talk about the use of GIS to support public participation, we have the label of PPGs, so public participation GIS or participatory GIS. In our case, we decided to combine GIS with the MCDM by giving a weight to the spatial criteria and visualizing the impacts of transport choices. This is just an example of impacts that can be visualized by stakeholders, and this is a map that we presented to some stakeholders in another case studies related to the connection between a metro station with the university sites. So, of course, for stakeholders, it is important to see the consequences of the different decisions to make them also aware of the impacts of these decisions. So let's directly go into this research with a case study, which is once again located in Catania, and is related to another aspect of micromobility, which is related to e-scooters. We know that also e-scooters are controversial. There are many cities that are banning them, at least in Europe. We know that they spread a lot in the US in 2018, more or less, while in Europe we had a spreading of them during and after the pandemic. We know that actually they can be good in some cases. They can be good, for instance, to promote multimodal trips in combination with public transport because they are very small, so they can be put in the public transport vehicles, but they can also be left when they are shared close to the public transport stops or station, and they can be good in general to cover small trips. So we wanted to understand how a public administration should deal with this spreading of e-scooters, and in particular, how can we build a specific network for micromobility in car-oriented cities. So this is a paper that is not published so far, but it has been recently accepted for publication in a scientific journal. So if you are interested, I can send you the paper. And the idea is to combine spatial analysis with multi-criteria analysis to identify the relevant criteria, but also the priority paths for e-scooters. And in our case, we focused on university students' mobility and preferences. So just to have an idea of the overall methodology, we defined the criteria with students, so via participatory approach, since they were the main people that we wanted to engage. Then we performed this special data analysis through GIS and in particular QGIS. And then we performed a survey and asked students to make their own assessments using the AHP. So we had the weight of the different spatial criteria. And finally, we evaluated the priority index that we assigned to each arc of the network to understand their priority with respect to micromobility. So these are the criteria that were defined together with students. For instance, modal integration. So the paths that are in this network should be well connected with other transport modes, like public transport. Catchment area in terms of the potential users that should be close to the micromobility network. So for instance, this network should be close to the university venues. Route attractiveness in terms of the points of interest that can be reached by scooters and by this network. Safety related to the risk of accidents, but also the slope of the path that can be, of course, if there is a high slope, this can be unsafe for e-scooters. And the directness, so the possibility to connect the university sites using shortest paths, so using paths that are connected directly with the university sites. So just to give you an idea, these are some of the maps that we built with the data that we had. So the university venues that were localized and classified by the number of students, the road network and the existing cycle network in Catania. These are maps related to the population, number of inhabitants per census zone, public transport nodes and also points of interest, and finally the slope and also accidents localization. In the last map, we also have the shortest path that connect each of the university sites with each other. So these criteria were spatial. We could map them, and we could also assign each of these values to the different arcs of the map. So the idea is that if, for instance, the modal integration criterion is more important than safety, then we will give more weight to this criterion for each arc. If an arc of the network has a good modal integration because there is a public transport stop, but it's not so good in terms of safety because there were accidents, depending on the weight of the different criteria, this can change the value of this index. So I hope this description was clear enough to understand how it worked. And this was done by creating this priority index of each arc, which is a linear combination of the scores for each criterion, considering the weights of the criteria that we derived via the AHP. Results. We did this survey some years ago. The results were not so good at that time because 48% of students never used any scooter and was not used for systematic trips. So in this case, to go to the university. But this was just the beginning of the spreading of e-scooters. Now we have lots of e-scooters operators and students usually ask for incentives to use them. And we as university are providing them some discounts and making some agreement with these operators to have these discounts. And finally, from the HP, we had these results. Safety was considered as the most important criterion, followed by modal integration and catchment areas, and also directness, while route attractiveness was the least evaluated criterion. So we used these values and we evaluated the priority index. Of course, we had to do some kind of transformation of values and normalization. So this is just to let you see the different steps for the criteria evaluation. And these are the results with the mapping of the weighted PI. You can see that the more there are different colors. The blue ones mean that the priority is higher, and these blue arcs are more in the city center, of course. So this means that the city center is more ready to have e-scooters than the other parts of the city. But there are also some arcs which are red, so they are not so good. This means that the public administration should do something to make them better and safer, since safety was the first ranked criterion for students. But we can also see that there are some blue paths that are not so central, and maybe this mean and suggest that we or the policymakers should focus on maybe providing a micromobility network and then create some sub-networks in neighborhood which are connected to public transport, and this can be good to promote the modal integration. So this is just to give you an idea of how this spatial analysis can be combined with the AHP. And we also did this, but this is just to let you see that we used in a case with Anya and with Monica AMP in combination with spatial analysis. And the case study is very different in this case, in this the beautiful Cartagena de Indias in Colombia. So I will go directly to the results because the process was quite similar to the one that I described some minutes ago, even if we use the AMP and not AHP. I will just go to the spatial analysis. Just to let you see that from the AMP, we had different criteria that were considered more important, in particular street vitality, cultural elements, street traffic, and street connectivity, and we try to map these criteria. For instance, street vitality, we used GPS track data from OpenStreetMap to evaluate the liveliness that the space can transmit, and we also assigned a value with a measurement scale from 1 to 3, so low, medium, or high. Or, for instance, the cultural elements are related to the number of points of interest from OpenStreetMap, and also in this case we chose different ranges according to the different points of interest that we found in the specific case. We focused on the historical center of Cartagena de Indias, and we were able to map these indicators, so street vitality, street traffic, street connectivity, and finally cultural elements. We put together all these criteria with the weights derived from AMP, and finally we had this map, where you can see that there are some streets that have priority, more priority than others, the red ones, other streets that have less priority. So when we go to the public administration, we can tell them that they should focus first on the priority links. And what can be done? For instance, in this case, we can try to give priority to pedestrians. In this case, the topic was pedestrian mobility, so active mobility in general, but in this case, pedestrian mobility. For instance, the crossing can be raised, but also the street can be made in a way that the pedestrians is not the host while the cars should lower their speed. So there are different strategies that can be used. In this case, in this research paper, we gave some examples of how the public administration could act to improve the situation. So in conclusion, we saw that transport decisions are complex. They involve multiple stakeholders, so they require the use of specific ad hoc decision support methods. AHP can be a good method used both to elicit stakeholder preference and also find a collective preference ranking. So it can be used in this case to derive the priority vectors for stakeholders. And if used in combination with other methods, it can be beneficial to increase consensus in this process. So, of course, the idea is that if we have robust data and we have a transparent process, so we can go back to the previous phases, this can allow us to justify better the decision outcome. From the other side, say if we use the AHP and we combine technical analysis with stakeholder preferences, we can also support the decision-making process by making policymakers, in this case, aware of the different impacts. But of course, there are limitations. The first one is related to the use of quantitative methods for participation. They are not always easily understandable by stakeholders. They are considered sometimes as black boxes. Other experiences that we had, for instance, for a local traffic plan, suggest that they do not feel comfortable when we ask them to turn their preferences into numbers. So as future research, I would say that it is important to test other methods, in this case in combination with RHP, but also create a general framework for participatory decision support methods in transport planning, but also in other types of decisions according to the different phases. So thank you very much. I'm sorry it's almost the time, so I hope that I was clear enough, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michela.
Very much. So I think you were so clear that everybody, and your presentation was also so clear and beautiful that it was a pleasure to hear you, although
Yes.
it's that very late here in Europe. So let's move to the audience. Does anybody have any question?
I have some comments.
Okay.
First of all, I'm not in transport area, but I did a transport study in 1997 with two colleagues of mine. One of them was a transport expert who was consulting to the mayor, and another one city planning person. And what we worked on light rail systems, and what we recommended was implemented in Istanbul. This was AHP application as well. At that time, at the limitation of our study, we just said, if we had done this study again, we would involve the public as well. So at that time, we didn't involve it. And your presentation was excellent because it's not important that it was in transportation. It was excellent AHP application. Yeah. And it reminded me one article published in MCDA. When I read that one, I just said, oh, this is the best AHP application published in my judgment. That was it. But now I thought similar thing when you were making this presentation. I wish you could publish something like that in our journal, IJHP. Isn't it, Enrique? We need this kind of publications in our HP. And another comment I heard this morning with one colleague of mine, he was stating that AHP is an old strategy, and I respectfully disagreed with him because there are some very old strategy, very old methodologies are still being used. It is important that we use the appropriate methodology, and in your case, and the way you collected the data from the stakeholders, it was very interesting. So we can implement this kind of approach in any other study. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure getting to know you. I didn't know you before.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your nice word and comments. I totally agree with you. I have to say that I really like AHP because I think it's a very clear method from the beginning, because you structure the problem in a very easy way. Sometimes I have to admit I use it in my personal life and I try to make other people around me use it, but it's not always easy, no? When I was, performing this type of research and I was asking what type of methods, I thought that AHP was perfect to start with. And then, of course, there are other methods that can be used, but I really liked it. And this is why we are trying to use it also for other applications, for instance, for the spatial analysis. And let's see if we can use it in the future for other types of applications. Thank you again.
Yeah. And again, in another experience, this was supply chain problem, and we thought that AMP was more appropriate, but we couldn't convince the decision maker. AMP we could only convince because she just said I prefer simple solution rather than precise, and we did it. We had to do it. And we published that one. Later on, since the decision maker knew AHP, she was willing to do AMP as well. We did the study later on with the AMP. Actually, but his ranking didn't change. Preference rating was a little bit different. So she was very confident that, okay, she was selecting one supplier. She said, oh yeah, I will continue with this supplier.
Nice. Thank you very much for this.
I wish there were more participants. There were some. I think it is very late. I know in Turkey it is now 10 o'clock. In Asia it might be midnight. So I think
it's
why
yeah.
people there should be more participants in the session. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think Enrique wants to talk, right?
Yes. Well, first of all, very, very interesting.
Enrique, we cannot really hear you.
Yeah, now we cannot hear you, Enrique.
Cannot hear me?
No. Do you have a micro?
Yeah.
What?
I think
I'm sorry, I didn't see the chat. So
I didn't see that there was something in the chat now.
Yeah, sorry about it. I just talked.
How about now? Do you hear me now? Do you hear me? No?
Not very well.
Not very well, but you can try it. We can.
Okay, well, first of all, it's a very interesting, very detailed presentation. I was thinking, I recall several years ago, there was one of the AHP colleagues and friends, Yuki Sato, from Japan. He was...
we still cannot understand well.
We cannot understand you, Enrique.
Okay.
Probably if you talk closer to your computer.
Microphone.
Get closer, yeah.
Yeah, because
Closer?
we hear you, but very far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you hear me now?
A little bit better.
Well, I tried to know it was not. I guess I don't want to. How about now?
But maybe you can write it if it's not so.
The last thing I have applauded. Do you hear me now? No?
Yeah. If you speak slowly, maybe we will understand what you want to say.
Yeah.
Okay. I recall several years ago, Yuki Sato from Japan, he performed several studies that showed that when involving the public as participants, the survey really made a big difference, not just in the response rates, but even in the accuracy of the responses, because AHP is relatively easy, but it's much harder than the typical Likert scale from 1 to 5, right?
Yeah.
Have you had any experience about the surveys that you use? Are they graphical? Are they, I like to know a bit about that also.
So if I understood correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong. You are saying that AHP is easy to understand, but it depends on how you pose the question to the people, no? So the questionnaire.
Yes, and even the design of the question, of the graphical.
The design of the questionnaire, yeah. So in the first case study, actually the questionnaire was done together with them. So I was the facilitator, and there were these 7 panelists, and they already structured the problem together, so they knew the problem, and it was easy for them to fill they directly had to fill the pairwise comparison matrices with me. So it was not a real questionnaire. And for the citizens, it was a simplified questionnaire, so it was not AHP. While for the second case study, which was the one related to micromobility, and we also performed other similar questionnaires, we, let's say, put a general description at the beginning, like we have different criteria to promote micromobility. For instance, modal integration, which is this one, the safety, which is related to this one. So please state among the 2 criteria, which is more important for you and how much is more important. So the typical AHP. But I also have an example in the presentation just to let you see how we did this. Okay, here. So, no, maybe I can put it in the new slides so you can see it better. So, for instance, question 14. Which one of the 2 criteria do you think is the most important? Path connectivity to public transport stops, model integration. Path proximity to high demand areas. So we explained it, and then we use the name of the criteria. Equally important. And then the other question was, how much you think that the selected criterion is more important than the other? I would say that there was someone who replied equally important, and then here replied like 2 or 3. So of course, in this case, he or she didn't understand very well the question. But in most of the cases, when they replied equally important, they also put 1 if they were equally important. And in the other cases, they put a value that we were able to convert to 9, or for instance, the reciprocal value if the second one was more important. So I would say that it was a simple structure of the questionnaire, and they usually understood it. We did not have any particular problem, let's say. I hope this answered your question.
Actually, I wouldn't use this numerical scale. I would just use the verbal scale.
Yeah.
My experience, verbal scale really reflects what decision maker thinks. Again,
Yeah.
I don't like geometric scale. Again, when we were doing this transportation problem, we were using expert choice. There was geometric scale there, so we used geometric, and results were obviously incorrect. So I think they put it because maybe practitioners want to use it. So.
Well, I'm sorry. I want to say just the same thing. That there is it's not to use the numerical scale with people which is not used with numbers. I use words. We're talking words, not in numbers. And Michelle, I have another concern about your model. You use benefit and cost in the same hierarchy. In the tree, you put if you can see their model, Michela.
Yes. Yes, you are right in the first case.
In the first case, right.
We used as indicators both costs and benefits. Yeah, you're right.
Under economic criterion. And that's, from my opinion, Michela, just my opinion, this is not right. You don't have to do that. Because if I have to compare benefit with costs, how many times benefit is better than cost? Infinite.
Yeah, I see your point. Actually, I have to tell you, I had some concerns related to this hierarchy when we built it together with the experts, because it was built by them. It was not something that we proposed them. So when they proposed to consider both the costs and benefits, my concern was that it was not also very clear how to evaluate costs and benefits and how they would rank the two. So if the cost is more than the benefit, for instance, for the alternative cycling network. Yes, but I don't know. I don't understand if it's not correct from the point of view of the use of AHP, or it's something that it's difficult to assess, in your opinion.
No, it's not correct in the use of HP.
Because they are related.
Yeah, you have to address the people if you are measuring benefits or you're measuring costs. People have to be very clear if the goal it's a benefit or the goal is a cost. They have you change your mind, you change your way to compare if you are thinking in benefits or you are thinking in costs. That's why it's good to put all together in the same model, and also try to put the model in the address, in the direction of benefit, or in direction of cost, or in direction of risks. Do not mix criteria of risk or benefit in the same model. That's confused the people.
Okay. Thank you very much for this suggestion, because you know,
il mio piacere, Michela, il mio piacere.
I'm not so expert of AHP as you are, so any comment and suggestion is very, very welcome. So thank you.
Okay.
Can I say, Monica?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I really love the presentation, and thank you very much, Michela. And I really love it. Every part of it. It's really beautiful. And I also want to thank you on behalf of Creative Decisions Foundation. Roseanne has a doctor's appointment, so she couldn't make it today. But it's our great pleasure to have you here today.
Yes,
thank you very much again.
I have several questions, Michela, but it's too late, so I'll call you afterwards another day.
Exactly.
Okay.
I guess Hania has the same thing.
Nice presentation.
Yeah, great presentation.
Yes.
Very beautiful, prepared, lovely. Really.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks for coming, Michela.
You're welcome, but thank you for inviting me first.
Okay.